And there was a interesting Clubhouse chat room about what is conservatism, and one person said that it doesn't really have a definition other than not being liberal or something. And what I'm kind of gleaning from my conversations with on this topic is that it's the nuancification of the rule and of the standard and of the norm, of trying to figure out what that norm is, what that standard is. And whereas a version of liberalism that I'm watching, that I'm immersed in, is glorifying the exception, is trying to rule by exception, trying to say that pardon me, all norms are oppressive, essentially, and they always leave somebody out. There's always some othering that's happening. And I just wonder what you think about that, like the not the glorification and the calcification of the rule, of the norm, of the standard, but the understanding and the respecting of that. Is that fair to say what the right is trying to do, or if that is a part of the project of this?
Yeah, I mean, one of the most irritating, I think, discussion ticks of our age is to respond with exceptions to any generalized statement, right?
It happens all the time.
It happens constantly. It's not a good mode of argument, and it's also just if we took it to its logical extreme, we could not speak about anything of interest at all, right? When I say that men and women are different, I find that to be a really interesting thing to explore, how we're different. And you can't explore that topic if every 5 seconds somebody is saying, well, I'm a woman and I really enjoy coding, right? And I just don't find that mode of discourse to be at all interesting. It's really frustrating, and it introduces an element of emotionality into the discussion, because usually the exception has something to do with you, right? It's either you or somebody you know, your friend, your family. But if we talked about anything else this way, we would never be able to make any kind of generalizations, and therefore we would never be able to observe any kind of patterns in society, which is, I mean, our brains are basically pattern recognition machines. And to tell us that we can't recognize patterns overall because there's an exception here or there that might be emotionally fraught is ridiculous. So that's, sort of a mode of debate aside.
Okay. Yeah.
In terms of what conservatism is, I think in America, and this is now controversial within the right, I think, but I think in America it has to be conserving something about our founding, or 1776. I don't think conservatism has meaning, and this is where, I part with sort of Kirk and Burke. I think Kirk more than Burke, if anything. But I don't think that American conservatism can have meaning without reference to the founding. We are an intentionally founded country, and we have to think about at what level of generality and what abstract level we'd like to preserve from that founding, because otherwise I think we're totally unmoored and we don't have much in common, right? I think this is actually a huge part of why our discourse is so bad now and why we are at each other's throats so badly. It's because the left, for arguably around 50 years, maybe a little longer, has taken direct aim in a way that they had previously taken oblique aim at the founding, right? So if you look at Woodrow Wilson, for example, his reforms, his progressive era reforms, were very sort of anti-constitutional, right? And you read his actual academic work, he describes the U.S. Constitution as clunky, outdated, unable to cope with the governing challenges of the modern world. But when he ran for president, he still had to do that lip service, right? He had to frame everything. FDR the same way, right? He talks about a second Bill of Rights. He's talking about within the confines, even though the New Deal and some of the laws that were consequently passed to deal with the Great Depression did fundamentally transform and in I think a negative way the U.S. Constitution, they still had to reference that canon, right? It was necessary for any American politician and frankly anybody who wanted to really be sort of taken seriously in American popular discourse to reference the good about our founding. Not that it's perfect, and not to downplay the major sins in the founding, but to reference the abstract idea is something that we should continually strive towards, a more perfect union, right? I think for the last 50 years, we've had a increasingly powerful part of the left that overtly denies that, right? That says there was anything good and worth preserving about 1776. And that's the most obvious case, of course, would be 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah-Jones. But I think that's much more of a capstone on a project that's been going on for decades in academia. And the problem is when we don't have, even at that abstract level, that kind of agreement of the broad percentage of society on the abstract principles of 1776, on equality and liberty being two important, weights of American politics. If we don't have that focus anymore, and we attack that, it's not clear to me what else Americans have in common, right? We're not France. We don't have we have certain elements in common culturally. There is such thing as an American culture, but it's not nearly as strong or unified as French culture. We also
they've condensed theirs into a sauce over ages.
We're much more fractured. We're bigger geographically. We don't have that core ethnic group that France has, which is basically a tribe where they've added some people around the edges and drew some borders, which is mostly the story of almost every country other than the United States, where we have an intentional founding and a multi-ethnic one from the beginning. And here I'm not just referring to enslaved Africans who were brought here, but to Jews who were here, to different groups that we now call white, but then saw themselves as very different nations of people, right? The Irish, Scots-Irish, Brits, and Germans all saw themselves as very different nations. This doesn't have – the United States has never had a real tribal identity, and we've always had to find a way to seam together different types of people. And it seems to me that the glue, when that glue falls apart, as it did before the Civil War and the decades prior to the Civil War, exactly over the issue of slavery, where you have the South moving from a sort of eventual abolition position for the most part in the early 1790s and during the founding era. As you get into the 1830s and 40s, you get more actual defense of slavery and saying, well, what Thomas Jefferson wrote is wrong, right? We aren't born equal. We're very clearly born unequal, and that's why slavery is good and right. The nation couldn't survive that. Yeah. So it tore itself in two over that question. And I see it in a similar way. We're kind of tearing ourselves up now because if we don't have 1776 in common, I don't know what else binds us together as American citizens as opposed to other countries in the globe.
Yeah, I guess all we have is a military infrastructure, which isn't going to sustain itself, and which is, we have to keep that in check with some sort of civilian order, and then we have the economy. But those two things don't make a nation. Those two things don't make a nation.
I agree with that.
Because within that, all there is power games to control those two things, and that leads necessarily to dissolution.